Picture this. You're lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by the steady beeping of machines, your family gathered around you whispering about your condition. Think you're in a deep coma, completely unaware of their presence. But what if you could hear every single word they said? What if they started sharing secrets they never thought you'd discover? What if those secrets weren't just embarrassing family stories, but devastating betrayals that would change everything you thought you knew about the people you loved most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's exactly what happened to me 3 months ago in Phoenix, Arizona. My name is Emma, and what I'm about to tell you will shake you to your core. For 28 years, I believed my family genuinely cared about me, even if I always felt like the outsider. I worked tirelessly as a graphic designer, saved every penny to buy my small house in Tempe, and tried my best to maintain relationships with people who seemed to barely tolerate my existence. But when a devastating car accident left me fighting for my life in Desert Valley Medical Center, my family's true nature emerged in ways I never could have imagined. What I discovered during those 7 days when they thought I'd never wake up wasn't just shocking. It was a carefully orchestrated web of lies, theft, and manipulation that had been going on for years, right under my nose. They thought they were safe to finally speak the truth. They thought wrong. The revenge I got wasn't just satisfying, it was absolutely devastating for them and completely liberating for me. The Arizona sun was blazing hot that Tuesday morning in June when I left my house in Tempe for what I thought would be just another ordinary day at Phoenix Creative Studios downtown. I'd spent the previous night working on a logo design for a local restaurant chain, staying up until nearly 2 a.m. perfecting the color gradients and typography. As a freelance graphic designer, I'd built my reputation on attention to detail and meeting impossible deadlines, which had finally allowed me to purchase my modest 2-bedroom house 3 years prior. My morning routine was always the same. Strong coffee in my favorite ceramic mug that read, "Design is Life," a quick scan of my emails to see if any urgent projects had come in overnight, and a glance at my bank account to make sure the latest client payments had cleared. Money had always been tight, especially growing up as the middle child in a family where my older brother Mark seemed to excel at everything effortlessly, and my younger sister Jessica charmed everyone with her bubbly personality and natural beauty. I was the quiet one, the one who preferred sketching in corners during family gatherings, while everyone else shared stories and laughter. My parents, Janet and Robert Thompson, lived in a sprawling house in Scottsdale that they'd purchased when my father's construction business took off during the housing boom 15 years earlier. The house had 5 bedrooms, a pool, and a 3-car garage filled with my father's collection of vintage motorcycles. Growing up there, I always felt like I was taking up space that could be better used by my more accomplished siblings. Mark had become a successful real estate agent, following in my father's footsteps with property development, while Jessica worked part-time as a yoga instructor and spent most of her time posting lifestyle content on social media. Despite feeling like the family outsider, I made an effort to maintain regular contact with them. Sunday dinners at their house were a monthly tradition I rarely missed, even though conversations often centered around Mark's latest property deals or Jessica's growing Instagram following. My graphic design work was usually dismissed with polite nods and quick subject changes to more interesting topics. Still, they were my family, and I believed that, despite their lack of enthusiasm for my career choices, they fundamentally cared about my well-being. That Tuesday morning, I was particularly excited because I'd finally landed a contract with a major Phoenix-based corporation that could potentially set me up financially for the next 2 years. The meeting was scheduled for 10:30, and I'd prepared an extensive portfolio showcasing my best work from the past 5 years. As I drove my reliable but aging Honda Civic through the busy streets of Phoenix, I couldn't help but imagine how proud my family might finally be when I shared this news with them. The last thing I remember clearly was stopping at a red light at the intersection of Campbellback Road and Central Avenue, reviewing my presentation notes one final time. The light turned green, I pressed the accelerator, and then everything went black. According to the police report I would read weeks later, a distracted driver running a red light slammed into the driver's side of my car at nearly 50 miles per hour. The impact was so severe that it took emergency responders over an hour to extract me from the wreckage. When I regained consciousness 7 days later in Desert Valley Medical Center, my first sensation wasn't pain or confusion about where I was. It was the crystal clear memory of conversations I'd heard while supposedly unconscious. Voices I recognized intimately had been discussing things that made my blood run cold. My mother's voice talking about insurance policies, my father discussing property transfers, my brother and sister making plans for money they seemed to think would soon be available to them. Dr. Rachel Green, a kind woman in her 40s with gentle hands and a reassuring smile, explained that I'd suffered a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, and internal bleeding that had required emergency surgery. For the first 3 days, she said, my condition had been critical and uncertain. My family had been told there was a significant possibility I might never wake up, or if I did, that I could have permanent brain damage affecting my cognitive abilities. What Dr. Green didn't know, and what I couldn't immediately explain to her, was that while my body had been fighting for survival, my mind had been completely alert and processing every conversation that took place in my hospital room. The human brain, I learned later, sometimes maintains consciousness even when the body appears completely unresponsive. It's a rare phenomenon, but it happens often enough that medical professionals have a name for it: covert consciousness. As I lay in that hospital bed, connected to machines monitoring my vital signs, my family had gathered around me multiple times over those 7 days. What they didn't realize was that their grief-stricken whispers and private conversations were being recorded in perfect detail by a mind they believed was no longer functioning. They thought they were safe to finally speak the truth. They thought wrong.
Been hiding for years. The first conversation I remembered clearly had taken place on the second day. My mother's voice, usually so controlled and proper during family gatherings, had carried a tone I'd never heard before. She was speaking quietly to my father near the foot of my bed, apparently believing I couldn't hear anything they said. "Robert, we need to talk about Emma's house," she had whispered, her voice carrying an urgency that seemed inappropriate for someone grieving their unconscious daughter. "If she doesn't make it, or if she has brain damage like the doctor mentioned, she's not going to be able to manage those mortgage payments or maintain the property." My father's response had been equally shocking. "I've already spoken to Mark about it. The house is in a good neighborhood, and property values in Tempe have gone up significantly since she bought it. We could probably get at least $40,000 more than what she paid for it." The casual way they discussed selling my home while I lay fighting for my life.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Was devastating enough, but what came next completely shattered my understanding of who these people really were. My mother had continued, "She's always been so secretive about her finances. I still don't understand how she managed to save enough for a down payment on that place. Mark thinks she might have more money saved than she's ever let on." "Jessica mentioned something interesting yesterday," my father had replied, his voice dropping even lower. "She said Emma's been getting larger checks from clients lately, much larger than the small projects we thought she was working on. If there are significant savings accounts we don't know about, we need to make sure we can access them if necessary." The word access had sent chills through my supposedly unconscious body. They weren't talking about managing my affairs to help me recover. They were discussing how to take control of assets they assumed I'd no longer be able to protect. But this was only the beginning of what I would learn over those 7 days of covert consciousness. On the third day, when doctors had told my family that my condition remained critical and unpredictable, Jessica and Mark had visited together while our parents were handling what they called arrangements with lawyers and insurance companies. Their conversation revealed layers of deception I never could have imagined. I can't believe we're actually going to go through with this, Jessica had said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and guilt. It feels wrong to be planning this while she's lying here like this. Mark's response had been cold and calculating. Jess, we've been planning this for months. Emma being in this accident doesn't change the fact that she's the one obstacle to everything we've worked toward. If anything, this situation makes everything easier. But what if she wakes up? Jessica had asked. What if she finds out what we've been doing? She's not going to wake up, Mark had replied with a certainty that made my heart race despite my motionless body. And even if she does, Dr. Green said there could be permanent cognitive damage. She might not remember anything from before the accident, or she might not be mentally capable of handling complex financial matters. What they discussed next revealed a conspiracy that had been unfolding for over a year without my knowledge. Apparently, my siblings had discovered that our grandmother, who had passed away 2 years earlier, had left a substantial inheritance specifically to me in her will. The inheritance included not just money, but also valuable property in northern Arizona that I had never been told about. According to Jessica, our parents had been managing grandmother's estate and had never informed me that I was the primary beneficiary. Instead, they had told Mark, Jessica, and me that grandmother had left everything to charity, with only small sentimental items distributed among the family. The reality was that I had inherited nearly $200,000 and a cabin on 40 acres of land near Sedona that was worth at least another $150,000. The paperwork is all ready, Mark had explained to Jessica. Dad's lawyer friend helped us prepare everything so that if Emma is declared mentally incompetent, or if she doesn't survive, the inheritance gets redistributed among the family as it should have been in the first place. Jessica sounded uncertain. Are you sure this is legal? It seems like stealing. It's not stealing, Mark had insisted. Grandmother clearly made a mistake in her will. She was old and confused toward the end. There's no way she intended to leave everything to Emma while giving nothing to us. We're just correcting an obvious error. The manipulation and justification in his voice had been sickening. They had convinced themselves that stealing my inheritance was actually justice, that I somehow didn't deserve what our grandmother had specifically chosen to leave me. But this was only the beginning of what I would learn over those 7 days of covert consciousness. During the 4th day, when doctors had told my family that my condition remained critical and unpredictable, my father had a visitor I was actually surprised to see there. Mark. My brother had always been a loner, avoiding family gatherings whenever possible and never showing any real concern for my welfare. Yet here he was at my hospital bed, half the time my parents had spent there. The conversation between my father and Mark revealed that Mark had been actively participating in a plan to discredit me and sanction some of my assets. Mark had apparently been using his tech skills to access my email and social media accounts, looking for anything that could be used against me to claim that I was unfit to administer my own affairs. There had been a concern that if I did recover fully, I might potentially use my creativity and skills to access even more financial opportunities in the digital world. My family seemed to have no doubt that I was more successful than they were aware of. But the revelation that my brother had been conspiring with my parents to steal my inheritance and look for ways to discredit me was something I could have never imagined. I had always known that my immediate family had strained relationships, but this was another level of betrayal and greed.
During one of their visits, Emma's credit score is better than mine, so I qualified for a much higher limit. I've been using it to flip properties, and I always pay it back before she would see any statements. She never checks her credit report, so she has no idea. Jessica had been impressed rather than horrified. How much have you made using her credit? About $30,000 in profit over the past 6 months, Mark had replied proudly. I've been putting the money aside to buy out her share of the Sedona property once we get control of the inheritance. The casual way they discussed committing identity theft and credit fraud while I lay unconscious had been devastating. These weren't desperate people making impulsive decisions during a crisis. These were calculated criminals who had been systematically stealing from me for months while maintaining the facade of a loving family. But perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation had come from my parents themselves. During one late-night conversation, when they thought hospital staff wasn't paying attention, They had discussed their true feelings about me with an honesty that was absolutely crushing. "I know we shouldn't talk about this now," my mother had whispered to my father, "but maybe this is a sign that we can finally focus on the children who actually appreciate us." My father had agreed immediately. "Emma's always been difficult, Janie. She's never fit in with the family, never shared our values, never seemed grateful for anything we provided. Mark and Jessica have always been more like us. Remember when she moved out and bought that house without asking for our help or advice?" My mother had continued. "Most daughters would want their parents involved in such a major decision. But Emma just handled everything herself and then told us after it was done." The complete distortion of reality in their words had been staggering. I had handled the house purchase independently because they had always made it clear that my financial decisions were my responsibility. When I had mentioned looking at houses months before my purchase, they had dismissed the idea as unrealistic given what they assumed was my limited income. I had stopped including them in the process because their lack of support and constant negative comments had been discouraging and stressful. "She's never needed us the way Mark and Jessica do," my father had said. "Maybe that's why it's easier to think about losing her than it would be to think about losing one of them." Those words had cut deeper than any physical pain from my injuries. My parents, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, had essentially admitted that they wouldn't miss me if I died. They saw my independence not as strength, but as rejection of their love and authority. They interpreted my self-sufficiency as evidence that I didn't value family, when in reality, I had learned to be self-sufficient because relying on them had never been an option. As the days passed and my supposed condition remained unchanged, their conversations became more specific and detailed about their plans. They had already contacted lawyers about having me declared mentally incompetent if I survived with brain damage. They had researched the process for taking control of my financial assets and property. They had even discussed selling my house and using the proceeds to pay for long-term care facilities if necessary, while keeping any excess funds for the family's needs. Mark had been particularly thorough in his planning. He had researched my mortgage company and discovered that my life insurance policy through work would completely pay off the house if I died. He had calculated that between the insurance payout, the sale of my house, the grandmother's inheritance, and my savings accounts, the family would gain access to nearly $500,000 in assets they currently couldn't touch. "It's not like Emma would miss any of it," he had reasoned to Jessica. "If she has permanent brain damage, she's not going to be capable of managing money anyway. And if she doesn't make it, the money just goes to lawyers and the state instead of staying in the family where it belongs." The way they had twisted the situation to make themselves the victims and me the obstacle had been masterful in its manipulation. They had convinced themselves that taking everything I had worked for was actually a form of family loyalty and financial responsibility. But what ultimately saved me from their schemes was the one thing they couldn't predict or control: my body's natural healing process. On the 7th day, when Dr. Green was conducting her morning examination, my eyes opened and I was able to speak clearly and coherently. The brain damage they had been counting on hadn't occurred. The cognitive impairment they had been hoping for was non-existent. I was fully conscious, fully aware, and now fully informed about who my family really was. The look of shock and disappointment on my mother's face when I first spoke wasn't the relief and joy you'd expect from a parent whose child had just returned from the brink of death. It was the expression of someone whose carefully laid plans had just been completely destroyed. My father's reaction was even more telling. He immediately asked Dr. Green about my cognitive abilities and whether there might be any memory loss from the accident. Mark and Jessica, who had arrived at the hospital within an hour of being called about my awakening, spent their visit asking seemingly innocent questions about what I remembered from before the accident and whether I felt confused about anything. Their concern wasn't for my well-being, it was to determine if their secrets were still safe. But I was done being the naive family member who assumed the best about people who never deserved that trust.
7 days of listening to their true thoughts and plans gave me something more valuable than money or property: absolute clarity about who these people were and what I needed to do to protect myself from them. As I lay in that hospital bed, smiling and nodding at their false expressions of relief and love, I was already planning my own response to their conspiracy. They thought they had been so clever manipulating a situation they believed I'd never understand. They thought wrong. The revenge I was about to unleash wouldn't just protect my assets and expose their crimes, it would give them a taste of the betrayal and helplessness they had planned to inflict on me. What they didn't realize was that their biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my ability to survive the accident. Their biggest mistake was underestimating my ability to survive the truth about who they really were. The first 24 hours after waking up were crucial for maintaining the facade that I was still the trusting, naive Emma they had always known. Every instinct screamed at me to confront them immediately, to demand explanations for the
conversations I'd overheard. But I forced myself to play the role of the grateful daughter who was simply happy to be alive and surrounded by family. The performance was exhausting, but absolutely necessary if I wanted to gather enough evidence to protect myself and potentially pursue legal action against them. Dr. Green had explained that I would need to remain in the hospital for at least another week for observation and recovery. My ribs were still healing, and she wanted to monitor me for any delayed symptoms from the concussion. This extended hospital stay actually worked to my advantage. It gave me time to plan, while keeping my family convinced that I was still vulnerable and dependent on their care and support. During their visits, I carefully observed their behavior with new eyes, noting details I had missed before the accident. Mark's expensive watch and designer shoes seemed inconsistent with what I knew about real estate agent salaries in Phoenix. Jessica's frequent mentions of spa treatments and shopping trips suggested access to more disposable income than a part-time yoga instructor should have. My parents' casual discussions about expensive home renovations and vacation plans indicated they weren't as concerned about retirement savings as they had previously claimed. Most telling was how they all seemed slightly disappointed by my rapid recovery and complete mental clarity. When Dr. Green had announced that my cognitive functions appeared completely normal and that I showed no signs of memory loss, the brief flash of frustration across my father's face had been unmistakable. My mother had immediately asked the doctor about potential delayed symptoms that might still develop, pressing for details about how long it might take to be completely certain about my neurological status. The questions they asked during visits were clearly designed to test my awareness of financial matters. Mark casually inquired whether I remembered my bank account numbers, or if I had any concerns about bills that might be piling up at home. Jessica wondered aloud whether I had been keeping important documents in a safe place, and whether anyone else knew where to find them if necessary. My parents suggested that once I was discharged, it might be wise to give them access to my accounts temporarily, just until I was feeling completely back to normal. Each of these seemingly innocent suggestions confirmed what I had learned during my covert consciousness period. They were still actively planning to gain control of my assets, just adjusting their approach now that their original strategy had been derailed by my unexpected complete recovery. But I had advantages they didn't realize. I knew their plans, I had heard their true feelings about me, and I was no longer constrained by family loyalty or the desire to maintain relationships with people who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial goals. My first priority was securing evidence of the crimes they had already committed. During one of Mark's visits, I managed to get a clear photo of his driver's license when he left his wallet open on my bedside table while searching for something in his jacket pocket. I needed his full name, date of birth, and address for the reports I planned to file with both law enforcement and credit monitoring agencies. I also memorized the license plate number of his car when I saw it parked outside my hospital window. Jessica had been easier to gather information about because she constantly documented her life on social media. While she sat beside my bed scrolling through Instagram and showing me posts from mutual friends, I was actually studying the background details of her recent photos.
The expensive restaurants, designer handbags, and luxury shopping trips she had been posting about for the past 6 months were completely inconsistent with her claimed income level. More importantly, several of her posts were geotagged at locations that corresponded with dates and times when Mark claimed to be conducting business meetings for his property investments. The connection between their activities became clearer as I pieced together the timeline. Mark had been using my forged signature and stolen credit to finance property flips, and Jessica had been his partner in these ventures, helping him scout locations and manage renovations while he handled the financial aspects. The profits they were making from these illegal investments were funding their upgraded lifestyles, and they had been planning to use my inheritance to expand their operations significantly. My parents' role in the conspiracy was more complex but equally criminal. Beyond hiding my grandmother's inheritance and helping to forge documents, they had been providing Mark and Jessica with information about my financial status and business activities. My father's connection at my bank had been feeding them regular updates about my account balances, income deposits, and spending patterns. This information had allowed them to time their credit card fraud perfectly, ensuring that their activities wouldn't be discovered during my routine financial management. But what truly infuriated me was discovering that they had been using my identity for more than just credit card fraud. During one conversation between my parents that I overheard while pretending to sleep, my mother mentioned that they had already submitted preliminary paperwork to have me declared mentally incompetent, using a backdated medical assessment from a doctor who owed my father money from a construction project. The paperwork had been prepared weeks before my accident, suggesting that they had been planning to have me declared incompetent regardless of whether I was actually incapacitated. This revelation made me realize that my car accident, while genuinely accidental, had simply accelerated plans they were already implementing. They had been systematically building a case for taking control of my assets, and my hospitalization had provided the perfect cover for moving forward with their scheme. If I had died in the accident, they would have inherited everything immediately. If I had survived with brain damage, they already had legal mechanisms in place to control my assets. The only outcome they hadn't prepared for was my complete recovery with full awareness of their activities. Armed with this knowledge, I began documenting everything I could remember from my covert consciousness period. Each night after visitors' hours ended, I used the Notes app on my phone to record detailed accounts of every conversation I had overheard, including approximate dates, times, and exact quotes where possible. I also began taking photos of my family members whenever they visited, ostensibly as happy recovery memories, but actually to document their presence at specific times and dates for potential legal proceedings. The most challenging aspect of gathering evidence was maintaining the pretense of being unaware of their true intentions, especially while they continued to act in their roles of loving family members.
Evidence was accessing my own financial records without alerting them to my suspicions. I couldn't simply call my bank or credit card companies from my hospital room without risking being overheard, and I didn't want to use the hospital's business center where my activities might be logged or monitored. Instead, I had to wait for opportunities when I was alone and alert enough to navigate complex phone systems while dealing with pain medication that sometimes affected my concentration. My breakthrough came when Ashley Martinez, my best friend and former college roommate, came to visit me on my 5th day of consciousness. Ashley was a paralegal at a criminal defense firm in Phoenix, and while we hadn't been in close contact for several months due to busy work schedules, she had heard about my accident through mutual friends and wanted to check on my recovery. Her visit provided the perfect opportunity to begin gathering professional help without alerting my family to my suspicions. Ashley immediately noticed that something seemed off about my family's behavior during her visit. Mark had been unusually interested in her conversation with me, frequently interrupting to ask about her work and whether she had experience with medical malpractice cases. Jessica had made several comments about how lucky I was to have such good insurance coverage and how smoothly the hospital's billing processes were handling my case. My parents had seemed nervous about having an outsider present during their visit, cutting their usual stay short and making excuses about needing to handle various arrangements related to my recovery.
After my family left, Ashley stayed behind and asked me directly if everything was all right with them. Her professional experience with criminal cases had taught her to recognize when family dynamics seemed suspicious, particularly around financial matters during medical crises. I realized that this was my opportunity to begin building a support network of people who could help me investigate and document my family's activities without compromising my safety or alerting them to my knowledge. I decided to trust Ashley with a carefully edited version of my concerns. I explained that during my unconscious period, I had sometimes been aware of conversations around me, and that some of what I had heard made me worry about potential financial impropriety. I told her that I was concerned my family might have accessed my accounts or made decisions about my assets without proper authorization, and that I wanted to conduct a thorough review of my financial status once I was discharged. Ashley's response confirmed that my instincts were correct. She explained that financial exploitation of incapacitated family members was unfortunately common, and that the legal system provided various protections for people in my situation. She offered to help me contact credit monitoring services and financial institutions to conduct comprehensive reviews of my accounts and credit history. More importantly, she suggested that we should document my current mental state and cognitive abilities through formal medical and psychological evaluations, creating an official record that would contradict any claims of mental incompetence. The conversation with Ashley gave me hope that I could successfully protect myself from my family's schemes. But it also made me realize how much evidence I would need to gather to prove their crimes. Financial fraud, identity theft, and document forgery were serious criminal charges. But prosecutors would need substantial proof to move forward with cases against multiple family members. I would need to demonstrate not just that crimes had occurred, but that they had been planned and executed deliberately over an extended period of time. My strategy began to focus on three parallel approaches. First, I would continue gathering direct evidence of their past and ongoing criminal activities through careful observation and documentation. Second, I would work with Ashley and other professionals to secure my assets and establish legal protections against future fraud attempts. Third, I would begin building a case for potential criminal prosecution by working with law enforcement agencies that specialized in financial crimes. The psychological aspect of this situation was perhaps the most challenging part. Every day, I had to sit in that hospital bed and smile at people who had been systematically stealing from me while planning to take everything I had worked for. I had to listen to their expressions of love and concern while knowing they had recently discussed how little they would miss me if I died. I had to accept their offers to help manage my affairs while knowing they intended to use that access to complete their theft of my inheritance. But the anger I felt was also motivating. For years, I had accepted being treated as the less important family member, assuming that their lack of enthusiasm for my accomplishments reflected normal family dynamics rather than active resentment. I had attributed their reluctance to include me in family decisions to my independent personality, rather than their strategic exclusion. I had interpreted their dismissive attitudes toward my financial success as protective concern, rather than jealous planning. Now I understood that every family interaction over the past several years had been influenced by their growing awareness of my financial stability and their corresponding plans to access those resources. Every suggestion that I was being too secretive about my finances had been an attempt to gather information for their schemes. Every comment about my need to be more generous with family had been preparation for taking my assets without permission. The depth of their deception was staggering, but it also gave me a tremendous advantage in planning my response. I knew exactly what they were planning because I had heard them discuss it in detail. I knew their methods because I heard them describe their techniques. I knew their timeline because I overheard their conversations about deadlines and next steps. Most importantly, I knew their assumption that I remained ignorant of their activities, which meant I could continue gathering evidence while they felt safe to proceed with their plans. Dr. Green had mentioned that I would likely be discharged by the end of the week if my recovery continued progressing smoothly. This gave me a limited window to complete my evidence gathering while maintaining access to hospital resources and my family's unguarded conversations. Once I returned home, they would expect me to be grateful for their help and eager to accept their assistance in managing my affairs during my recovery period. Instead, I would be ready to systematically dismantle their conspiracy and ensure that they faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. The planning phase was almost complete,
And soon, it would be time to move from passive observation to active protection of my assets and pursuit of justice for their betrayal. My grandmother had chosen to leave her inheritance to me for reasons I was only beginning to understand. Perhaps she had recognized the same character traits in my siblings and parents that had led them to feel entitled to other people's resources. Perhaps she had observed their tendency to take advantage of family members who showed kindness and generosity. Perhaps she had seen something in me that made her believe I would use her legacy responsibly and honor her memory appropriately. Whatever her reasons, I was determined to ensure that her wishes were respected and that the people who had tried to steal her final gift to me would face consequences that matched the severity of their crimes. The girl who had always tried to maintain family peace and avoid confrontation was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to hold people accountable for their actions, even when those people are family. The investigation was just beginning, but I already knew how it would end. They had made the mistake of revealing their true nature to someone they thought would never be able to use that knowledge against them. Soon, they would discover just how wrong they had been about everything they thought they knew about Emma Thompson. The day before my scheduled discharge, I received an unexpected visitor that would change everything about how I understood the scope of my family's betrayal. Mrs. Patricia Lewis, my elderly neighbor from Tempe, had somehow learned about my accident and made the hour-long journey to Desert Valley Medical Center using public transportation. She arrived during the late afternoon visiting hours, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from her garden and wearing the concerned expression of someone who had been genuinely worried about my well-being. Mrs. Lewis was in her 70s, a retired librarian who had lived next door to my house for over 15 years. We had developed a friendly relationship over the past 3 years since I had moved into the neighborhood. She often accepted packages for me when I was working late, and I helped her with yard work and grocery shopping when her arthritis made those tasks difficult. Our conversations were usually brief and centered around neighborhood happenings, but she had always struck me as observant and intelligent, with the kind of sharp memory that comes from decades of managing detailed information systems. What she told me during her visit revealed that my family's activities had been far more extensive and visible than I had realized. According to Mrs. Lewis, Mark had been visiting my house regularly for months, often arriving with Jessica and sometimes accompanied by people I didn't recognize. These visits had typically occurred during weekday afternoons when I would normally be working at client meetings or site visits, suggesting that someone had been monitoring my schedule closely enough to know when my house would be empty. Mrs. Lewis had initially assumed that I had given my siblings keys for legitimate reasons, perhaps to help with maintenance or to check on the property when I was traveling for work. But their behavior had gradually become more suspicious and concerning. They had been loading items into Mark's truck during these visits, including furniture, electronics, and boxes of what appeared to be personal belongings. When Mrs. Lewis had mentioned seeing them to me during one of our casual conversations several months earlier, I had seemed genuinely surprised and confused, which had made her begin paying closer attention to their activities. The most alarming information Mrs. Lewis shared was about activities that had occurred immediately after my accident. Within hours of my hospitalization, before anyone outside the family should have known about my condition, Mark and Jessica had arrived at my house with a moving truck and several people who appeared to be professional movers. They had spent the entire day loading items from my house, working with an efficiency that suggested they had planned this operation well in advance. Mrs. Lewis had been concerned enough about this activity to call the police, but when officers arrived to investigate, Mark had shown them official-looking documents that he claimed gave him authority to secure my belongings while I was incapacitated. The officers had accepted these documents without extensive verification, noting only that the family members seemed genuinely concerned about protecting my property from potential theft while I was unable to monitor it myself. What troubled Mrs. Lewis most was that the items being removed didn't appear to be things that needed protection from theft. They had taken my computer equipment, filing cabinets, artwork, and even small appliances. These weren't items that would typically be at risk if a house were left empty for a few weeks. Instead, it looked like they were removing anything that might contain financial information or have significant resale value. Mrs. Lewis had also observed that Jessica had spent considerable time in my house alone after the moving activities were completed, going through rooms systematically with what appeared to be a checklist or inventory sheet. She had taken photographs of various areas of the house, including inside closets, cabinets, and storage areas. This behavior had seemed particularly strange because it suggested she was documenting the location and condition of items that remained in the house. The timeline Mrs. Lewis described was particularly damning because it demonstrated that my family had been prepared to take immediate action following my accident. The speed and organization of their response indicated extensive prior planning rather than spontaneous decisions made during a family crisis. They had already secured a moving truck, hired professional movers, and prepared legal documents before they could have known whether I would survive my injuries or what my recovery might look like. Even more concerning was Mrs. Lewis's observation that my family had returned to my house multiple times since the initial clearing operation. Mark had been there at least twice a week, often staying for several hours and sometimes meeting with people who arrived in expensive cars and carried briefcases. Jessica had visited less frequently, but seemed to be conducting some kind of business from my kitchen table, spreading out paperwork and making phone calls that often became heated or argumentative. Mrs. Lewis had overheard portions of these phone conversations through the thin walls between our houses. The discussions seemed to involve property transactions, financial transfers, and legal procedures that she didn't fully understand, but that clearly had them much worried. Mrs. Lewis had even overheard Jessica mention bank accounts in Switzerland, which had really piqued her interest.
Involved significant amounts of money. Jessica had frequently mentioned my name during these calls, often in contexts that suggested she was representing herself as acting on my behalf or with my authorization. The information Mrs. Lewis provided helped me understand that my family's conspiracy extended far beyond the credit card fraud and inheritance theft I had learned about during my hospital stay. They had essentially taken control of my entire life, accessing my home, removing my possessions, and conducting business using my identity and resources. The legal documents Mark had shown to police were almost certainly forgeries, but they had been sophisticated enough to convince law enforcement officers during a brief inspection. Mrs. Lewis also mentioned that she had noticed several pieces of mail addressed to me that had been delivered to Mark's address instead of my house. She had seen him collecting these items from my mailbox on multiple occasions, but had assumed I had arranged for mail forwarding due to extended travel or temporary relocation. Now she realized that my mail was being redirected without my knowledge or consent, which would have given my family access to bank statements, credit card bills, insurance documents, and other sensitive financial information. The scope of what Mrs. Lewis described was overwhelming, but it also provided me with crucial evidence and potential witnesses for the legal case I was building. Her detailed observations, combined with her reputation as a reliable and trustworthy community member, would carry significant weight with law enforcement agencies and prosecutors. More importantly, her willingness to get involved demonstrated that not everyone would simply accept my family's explanations for their suspicious behavior. After Mrs. Lewis left, I spent the evening processing the implications of what she had told me. My family hadn't just been planning to steal my assets, they had already begun systematically taking control of my entire life. They had invaded my privacy, stolen my possessions, and were actively impersonating me for financial gain. The accident had simply provided them with cover to accelerate activities they were already conducting illegally. I realized that returning to my house after discharge would be walking into a completely compromised environment. My family had keys, access to my mail, and familiarity with my daily routines and security systems. They had already removed items that might contain evidence of their crimes, and they were actively using my home as a base for their ongoing fraudulent activities. Going home would put me at physical risk and would likely result in the destruction of any remaining evidence before I could secure it properly. Instead, I began planning an alternative approach that would allow me to gather evidence while maintaining my safety and avoiding further losses. Ashley had offered to let me stay at her apartment temporarily,
which would give me a secure location to coordinate my investigation without alerting my family to my suspicions. From there, I could work with law enforcement and financial professionals to document the full extent of their crimes before confronting them directly. The conversation with Mrs. Lewis had also made me realize that other neighbors might have observed suspicious activities around my house. Phoenix neighborhoods often had active community watch programs and residents who paid attention to unusual behavior, particularly in areas like Tempe where property values made home security a common concern. If I could identify other witnesses who had seen my family's activities, I would have multiple independent sources to corroborate the timeline and scope of their crimes. I decided to ask Mrs. Lewis to help me contact other neighbors who might have relevant information. She knew most of the longtime residents in our area and would be able to approach them naturally without raising suspicions about an ongoing investigation. Her status as a concerned neighbor checking on my recovery would provide perfect cover for gathering witness statements and additional evidence. The next morning brought another revelation that confirmed how extensively my family had been monitoring and controlling my life. Dr. Green arrived for her final examination before my discharge, but instead of the routine medical check I expected, she seemed concerned about inconsistencies in my insurance coverage and billing information. According to her records, my insurance company had received several calls from someone claiming to be my medical power of attorney, requesting detailed information about my treatment costs, prognosis, and expected recovery timeline. The caller had identified himself as my brother and had provided personal information that seemed to authenticate his relationship to me. However, when Dr. Green had asked me directly about designating Mark as my medical power of attorney, I had no knowledge of any such arrangement. I had never executed any documents giving anyone authority to make medical decisions on my behalf, and I certainly hadn't authorized anyone to access my private medical information. Dr. Green explained that she had been uncomfortable with some of the caller's questions, which had focused more on financial aspects of my care than on my actual medical condition. He had asked detailed questions about whether my injuries would affect my ability to work, manage finances, or live independently. He had also inquired about the hospital's procedures for long-term care placement and whether there were circumstances under which family members could be granted legal authority over an incapacitated patient's affairs. This information revealed another dimension of my family's planning that I hadn't fully understood. They had been positioning themselves to take control of my medical care and legal status, not just my financial assets. By claiming medical power of attorney, Mark could potentially have influenced treatment decisions, accessed my medical records, and gathered information that would support their claims about my mental capacity or ability to manage my own affairs. The fact that they had made these calls while I was still unconscious demonstrated their urgency to establish legal control before I could potentially recover and object to their actions. If I had died or remained incapacitated, Mark's claimed authority would likely never have been questioned by medical or legal professionals. Even if I had recovered with cognitive impairment, his established relationship with my medical team would have given him significant influence on assessments of my mental capacity. Dr. Green assured me that she had not provided any confidential information to the caller and had instead insisted on verifying any power of attorney documents before releasing medical records. She had also noted the discrepancies in her files and would be reporting the unauthorized access attempts to
hospital's compliance department. This documentation would provide additional evidence of my family's fraudulent activities and their attempts to manipulate medical professionals. As my discharge time approached, I finalized my plans for the next phase of my investigation. Ashley had arranged for me to stay at her apartment for at least a week while we worked with her firm's resources to document my family's crimes and secure my assets. She had also connected me with Detective Kevin Park from the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, who specialized in cases involving family fraud and identity theft. Detective Park had agreed to meet with me the day after my discharge to review the evidence I had gathered and assess whether criminal charges were warranted. Ashley had briefed him on the basic facts of my case, and he had indicated that the scope of activities I described definitely constituted serious criminal offenses that warranted investigation. He had also suggested that we might be able to work with federal agencies if the crimes involved interstate financial transactions or mail fraud.
The meeting with Detective Park would be crucial because it would determine whether I could rely on law enforcement support for confronting my family or whether I would need to handle the situation through civil litigation alone. Criminal charges would carry more serious consequences and would send a clear message that their behavior had crossed legal boundaries, not just family relationship boundaries. Civil litigation might recover my losses, but wouldn't necessarily prevent them from attempting similar schemes in the future. I also plan to spend my first week out of the hospital conducting comprehensive reviews of all my financial accounts, credit reports, and legal documents. Ashley had arranged for me to meet with a financial advisor who specialized in fraud recovery and asset protection. This advisor would help me identify all the ways my family might have accessed or compromised my finances and would recommend steps to secure my accounts against future unauthorized access. The psychological preparation for this phase was as important as the practical planning. I would soon be confronting people who had betrayed my trust in the most fundamental ways possible, while maintaining expressions of love and concern for my well-being. I would need to maintain my composure while presenting evidence of their crimes and demanding accountability for their actions. Most importantly, I would need to be prepared for their likely responses, which would probably include denials, justifications, and attempts to manipulate my emotions or guilt me into dropping my pursuit of justice. Mrs. Lewis had offered to continue monitoring activities at my house and to document any further suspicious behavior she observed. She had also given me the contact information for 2 other neighbors who had expressed concerns about the activities they had witnessed. These additional witnesses would be crucial for establishing the timeline and scope of my family's crimes, particularly their activities during the period when I was unconscious and unable to protect my own interests. As I prepared to leave Desert Valley Medical Center, I reflected on how completely my understanding of my family had changed over the past 2 weeks. The people I had thought cared about me, despite their apparent lack of enthusiasm for my accomplishments, had actually been systematically planning to destroy my financial security and legal autonomy. The independence they had always criticized as selfishness had actually been my protection against their exploitation and manipulation. But I also realized that this experience had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. The passive, accommodating daughter who had always tried to maintain family harmony was gone, replaced by someone who was prepared to fight for what was right, regardless of the personal costs. The skills I had developed building my graphic design business, attention to detail, project management, client relationship management, were proving invaluable for investigating and documenting complex criminal activities. Most importantly, I had learned that real family relationships are built on genuine care and respect, not just shared genetics or childhood memories. Mrs. Lewis, a neighbor I had known for only 3 years, had shown more genuine concern for my well-being than the people who had raised me. Ashley, a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, had immediately offered practical help and professional resources when she learned about my situation. These relationships based on mutual respect and genuine caring were worth protecting and nurturing. The family members who had planned to steal my inheritance and destroy my independence had forfeited any claim to my loyalty or protection. They had made calculated decisions to prioritize their financial gain over my well-being, and now they would face the consequences of those decisions. The evidence I had gathered during my supposed unconsciousness would ensure that justice was served and that other potential victims would be protected from their schemes. As I signed my discharge papers and prepared to begin the next phase of my investigation, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that I had never experienced before. The accident that was supposed to have destroyed my life had instead revealed the truth about people who had been destroying it gradually for years. Now I had the knowledge and resources necessary to protect myself and ensure that their crimes were appropriately punished. The girl who had always tried to please everyone was gone, but the woman who had replaced her was stronger, smarter, and absolutely determined to see justice done. My family had made the mistake of underestimating me once, and they were about to discover that they had created an enemy far more formidable than the compliant daughter they thought they knew.